Introduction. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft, Supernatural Horror and Literature, 1925. In Danse Macabre, his nonfiction appraisal of the horror genre, Stephen King proclaimed that H.P. Lovecraft's shadow, so long and gone, his eyes so dark and puritanical, overlie almost all the important horror overlie almost all of the important horror overlie almost all of the important horror fiction that has come since. If anything, King did not go far enough in his assessment. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was arguably the most influential writer, not only in the horror genre, but in the entire history of modern spectacle fiction. He has become nothing less than a pop culture icon, not a bad legacy for a depressive introvert who was never quite able to support himself with his writing. Was quick to scuttle to his own work, and one who died in obscure poverty at the age of 46. This volume collects a score of Lovecraft's most famous and successful tales of cosmic horror, ranging from the classic The Shadow over Innsmouth to the Dunwich Horror, and of course the Call of Cthulhu. Together they present a nightmare vision in which our everyday perception of the world is valued at less than nothing. Humans are the prey of cannibalistic ghouls and unknowable aliens. In reality is ruled by godlike nightmarish intelligence such as Narcolept, Yog, Soloth, and Cthulhu. This introduction will explain Lovecraft's life and how it influenced his horrific visions. Lovecraft's life. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in 1890, Providence, Rhode Island, to a traveling salesman father and a mother who could trace her ancestry back to the Pilgrims. The specter of madness that figures so prominently in his stories haunted his family too. His father was committed to a mental asylum, Butler Hospital, when Lovecraft was 3 years old. 26 years later, his mother would be committed to the same institution. She died in 1921 from complications after gallbladder surgery. The young Lovecraft was raised by his mother, 2 maternal aunts, and his grandfather, Whipple von Buren Phillips. It was his grandfather who instilled in him a love of literature and Gothic horror. The family was fairly well off until Van Buren Phillips' death in 1904, after which they fell into a straitened circumstances and were forced to move to a small house. Lovecraft was a precocious but sickly child. Though he was reciting and composing poetry at an early age, he barely attended public school and was evidently uncomfortable with other children. As an adult, he also avoided the company of most people and would often not go out during the day, though he was a prolific letter writer. Lovecraft also suffered from sleep paralysis from an early age, a disorder in which the sleeper awakens in terror, convinced a hostile presence in the room, but unable to move. The night gaunts which appear in his stories were inspired by these episodes. Lovecraft's night terrors, combined with his own neurotic disposition, combined in 1908 to trigger what he later called a nervous breakdown. As a result, he never received his high school diploma. These tropes, the nervous, delicate narrator, of an ancient family but incapable of dealing with the modern world, who falls into an inevitable madness as well as the longing for a lost idyllic state, would often be found in his work. He did not invent these themes. They are certainly present in the work of writers who influenced them, such as Edgar Allan Poe, but they clearly held a special appeal for Lovecraft. Indeed, Lovecraft felt himself to be an anachronism, a misfit, an outsider. Even as a young man, he often referred to himself in correspondence as an aged gentleman, and sometimes dated letters from the 18th century. Lovecraft would likely have remained a recluse had he not written a letter to the pulp magazine Argosy in 1913. This led to a rousing correspondence that caught the attention of Edward F. Doss, who was a president of the United Amateur Press Association, a type of organization that in the days before internet bulletin boards collated individual contributions by the members and mailed them out in a magazine format. This led to not only the beginning of Lovecraft's prodigious letter writing, but also his first published story, The Alchemist, in 1916. His first commercial sale was in 1922. Unsurprisingly, he was rejected as an unfit military service for World War I, owing to his poor health and neurosis. It was at an amateur press conference in 1921, a few days after his mother's death, that Lovecraft met Sonia Green, a widow and successful businesswoman. Green was not only 7 years Lovecraft's senior, she was also Jewish and foreign-born. They married 3 years later, and Lovecraft moved into her Brooklyn apartment. Green is Lovecraft's only documented romantic or sexual connection, though she claimed he was a sufficiently adequate lover. Many have seen Lovecraft's lack of interest in the matter of living flesh and his slimy, writhing monsters either in asexuality or repressed homosexuality. Certainly he was close friends with the writer Samuel Loveman, who was gay. Green, for her part, blamed Lovecraft's overbearing mother. The two had remained close even after the latter's commitment to Butler. The marriage was, of course, doomed from the start. Grenay soon became sick and lost both her business and her savings in a bank failure. Lovecraft had constitutionally unsuited to the workaday world, made only a few half-hearted attempts to find a job, and even refused the editorship of Weird Tales, the magazine that published his best-known work. Since he would have to move to Chicago, Sonia had to take a job in Cleveland, and Lovecraft, separated from his wife, had to move into a small apartment near Red Hook, an area he disliked intensely. There he lived on a small allowance sent to him by his wife, preferring to spend money on mailing supplies instead of food, lost a dangerous amount of weight. Lovecraft returned to Providence in 1926, and he and his wife agreed to an amicable divorce, which was never finalized, making Green's 1936 marriage in Los Angeles technically bigamous. Lovecraft would remain in Providence for the last and most prolific decade of his life, when he produced works such as The Dunwich Horror, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and At the Mountains of Madness. He also made some money ghostwriting for clients such as Harry Houdini. It was probably due to his neurosis and sensitivity to rejection that he made no attempt to better his situation. Lovecraft did not try to sell The Shed over Innsmouth, though it would have most likely been successful, and ignored a publisher who offered to buy any longer works he had ready, even though The Case of Charles Dexter Ward only needed to be typed up and mailed in. Lovecraft's last years were marked by poverty, in which he again often went without food in order to be able to mail letters to his wide circle of correspondents, most likely fellow genre writers and fans. His health, never good, continued to decline. He was diagnosed with cancer in the small intestine in early 1937 and died in extreme pain at March 15. Lovecraft and the terror of the modern. Though we think of Lovecraft's staples as being gothic horror, the decaying past, inevitable decline and madness, he also wrote dreamlike fantasy and numerous essays. Lovecraft influences include, first and foremost, obviously Poe, but also the Anglo-Irish aristocrat and fantasy writer Lord Dunsay, Arthur Machen, the author of Great God Pan, the ghost story writer Algernon Blackwood, and Robert Chambers, whose short story collection In the King in Yellow he may have read in 1937. We find mention of these writers in his letters, and he took themes and even directly lifted ideas such as the King in Yellow and Yellow Sign from them. To be sure, Lovecraft's writing can be a bit challenging. His prose is convoluted, ornate, and deliberately archaic. Stephen King has also used the word blasonite. He has a special love for archaic spelling, synonym, and overblown expression. His stories are chock full of different ways to say old, scary, and incomprehensible. As Lovecraft himself explained in his 1920 essay, Literary Composition, future writers should note the varied mode of expression practiced by good authors and keep and keep in his mind for future use the many prosonant synonyms he encountered. Lovecraft took his advice to the extremes verbosity. Yes, this very baroque quality no doubt accounts for some of his work appeal. Like his monsters, Lovecraft's very prose is archaic, a thing out of time, yet despite, or perhaps more accurately because of his romantic attachment to the past, Lovecraft's sense of horror was a very modern one. Ultimately, his sense of the macabre is rooted in the 20th century. As an avid follower of scientific discovery, he once wished to become an astronomer. He noted in his essays and correspondence that the great leaps in knowledge that took place during his lifetime also cast mankind adrift in a vast, unknowable, and uncaring universe, suspended in a void of time with no absolute reference points with which to affix a philosophy of existence. Geology had laid bare the vast gulfs of eons that had reduced human history to a relative eye blink. In the chronology of creation, Einstein had upended the neat and noble Newtonian world of relatable cause and effect. As Lovecraft says in his 1937 essay, Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, the reason why time plays a great part in so many of my tales is that this element looms up in my mind as the most profoundly dramatic and grimly terrible thing in the universe. Conflict with time seems to me the most potent and fruitful theme in all human expression. Lovecraft's horror is thus essentially existential. The age-old perspective of a universe that placed humanity at the center of all existence, derived from a Christian worldview, had been replaced by one in which human beings and all they'd ever done or would ever do did not even rate the level of a cosmic joke. As he wrote to Farnsworth Wright, editor of Weird Tales, in a letter that accompanied the manuscript of the Call of Cthulhu, all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and emotions have no validity or significance in the cosmos at large. This is reflected in the opening passage of the story itself. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas and infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The scientists, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday, the piercing together of dissociated knowledge will open up in such terrifying vistas of reality, and our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. At the same time as the paradigm shifts of his day profoundly affected him. Lovecraft's writing also in so much represents a reaction against modernity. For instance, the antiquarian in him was opposed to modern art, especially movements such as Cubism and Primitivism. Lovecraft identifies these things with decadence, another boogeyman he took from the contemporary ideas of science, especially popular ideas of Darwinism. The tangents of pop Darwinism held that evolution was the survival of the fittest, and that this process was equivalent to, and indeed the source of all progress in both society and species. However, there was a darker side to this idea. If natural process of evolution could lead to one species or race being ennobled, rising up from the primeval muck to the heights of civilization, so too could they fall from the decadence. This fear gave rise to the eugenics movement, which sought to prevent the unfit members of society from reproducing. Though eugenics would ultimately culminate in the horror of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, there's also quite an active movement in the United States. Lovecraft and race. How many more pages? Okay, this is the last. This leads us to the aspect of Lovecraft's writing that is most troubling to the modern reader, and which has led to some readers who reject him outright: his treatment of race. An unrepresented racist and white supremacist. Lovecraft was especially troubled by immigration, which brought hordes of what he considered to be barely human refugees from southern and Eastern Europe to American shores. Nowhere is this more evident than the horror at Red Hook, not included in his volume, as it is universally considered one of Lovecraft's lesser works, where he had remarks of teeming masses of that Brooklyn neighborhood The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma. Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and I'm not saying that. Elements of impining upon one another. A babel of sound and filth, and sends out similar cries to answer the lapping, oily waves of its grimy peers. Similarly, In the Shadow over Innsmouth, published in 1931, 2 years before the Nuremberg laws, is essentially a diatribe against immigration, the unholy bargain the inhabitants of the New England port town have made with the deep ones, bringing them prosperity, but at the price of their own humanity. The government's solution is to round the inhabitants up and place them into concentration camps.